Hello, I'm Caitlin Griffith, and today I'm going to talk about the book Science Fictions: How Fraud, Bias, Negligence, and Hype Undermine the Search for Truth. This book was written by Stuart Ritchie. It was published just last year. Let's dig in. So, as an overview, Science Fictions deals with the distance between how we think science is and should be practiced and how it actually is being practiced in our shared reality. Ritchie starts off by establishing some norms, and he draws from Mertonian norms, which were developed by Robert Merton in 1942. He was a sociologist, and there are four. The first is universalism, which means that these norms are universally applied to all scientists, regardless of their position in their career or their institutional affiliation. The second is communality, which means that scientific results are published communally, are communally accessible, that the community can see the data. The third is disinterestedness, which means that scientists should be disinterested in the personal gain that they can get from a flashy or engaging scientific study and should instead be invested in the accurate carrying out of the scientific method. And the fourth is organized skepticism, which is for people who are reading studies to be scientifically skeptical of what they're reading so that we can see when researchers are making mistakes or maybe are acting off of unscientific motivations. Throughout the book, I think Ritchie reveals that science is a social construct, and that as much as we like to think that science is objective, that just like everything else that humans create, science is susceptible to manipulation. Ritchie mostly deals with natural science, economics, and psychology. I think those are the fields he's most familiar with, but I think that his conclusions are applicable to many different fields, including library science. So two of the four, but I think really five obstacles that Ritchie talks about are fraud and bias. There are a few ways that these things are made manifest. One is this replication crisis that we're in, which also links to publication bias, this bottom point here. This essentially means that scientific publications are disinterested in publishing studies that replicate the conclusions of previous studies and instead want to publish new research. Replication studies, I think a lot of us know, are very important because replicating results is the way that we reinforce scientific findings and conclusions. And so if we are almost exclusively focused on creating new conclusions instead of reinforcing the ones that we already have, then the science that we're growing into becomes flimsier. And I think that Ritchie does a really good job of demonstrating that statistically in the book, the longer term impacts of that. Another way that fraud manifests is through what I call benevolent fraud versus self-interested fraud. Self-interested fraud are on purpose manipulation, on purpose oversight. Benevolency comes into effect when scientists are studying things that they deeply believe in and that they're studying for the public good. A good example of this is medical studies. And so there are examples of scientists fudging the numbers or doing things like p-hacking, which we'll talk about in a minute, because they want to find medical treatments for debilitating diseases like Alzheimer's or cancer. They want to bring development to the public because they deeply believe in the work that they're doing. Even though it is motivated differently, statistically, the result is very similar. P-hacking and harking relate to each other in terms of bias. So the P in p-hacking stands for probability. Scientific studies have probability factors to help scientists determine if their conclusions are significant, statistically significant, or if they're background noise, if there's no discernible direction of their results. The threshold for a probability factor is 0.05 or 5%, essentially meaning that you should not have a more than 5% chance of your results being coincidence. The way that scientists can manipulate their probability is by slightly tweaking the environment in which pieces of the experiment happen to artificially lower their probability threshold below the 0.05 line. That is, according to Ritchie, not uncommon. And then the other element here is harking, which stands for hypothesizing after results are known, which means that, as we can see in this little cartoon here, that this sharpshooter shot his gun at this wall and is now, after the fact, drawing bullseyes around the holes. It's essentially the same thing where after results from the experiments or from the data collection come in, scientists change their initial hypotheses to fit the data. This is an example of bias. And then this last element we talked about a bit about already, publication bias, where publications want to publish the most interesting or exciting or seemingly revolutionary science and are less likely to publish studies that replicate or are less likely to study or to publish studies that return a null result, meaning that studies that demonstrate that there are no correlation between two things or that the findings were statistically insignificant in this particular study, publications like The Flash. The other elements that Ritchie talks about are negligence, hype, and perverse incentives. This picture here is an example of hype from the text that I really liked. This is what happens when scientists conduct studies that have statistically insignificant results. They come up with language in press releases to get public interest and interest from the scientific community about their statistically insignificant published results, and they use phrases like a trend that approached significance, fairly significant, significantly significant, narrowly eluded statistical significance, hovered around significance, very closely brushed the limit of statistical significance, and not absolutely significant, but very probably so. I just thought that was great. And this is definitely an example of hyping something up in order for flimsier scientific practices to be sort of looked over. This is definitely an example of hype and the impact that press releases have on the reputation of scientists and the reputation of the institutions that they're affiliated with, like universities or government agencies. Negligence has a lot to do with numerical errors. Sometimes they are unforced, sometimes they are truly accidental, but there's negligence in the rigor of checking those results. And then sometimes there are flaws on purpose. This also, I think, connects with bias and p-hacking in significant ways. Hype also connects with pop science and fad science. Ritchie talks a lot about nutritional science and dietary science in this context, and the shifting trend of, what's the diet now has to do with hype and the need to be groundbreaking. And then perverse incentives are also, I think, very connected to publication bias. The need to publish as a condition of employment. And so there are things like peer review fraud, citing yourself more than is socially or scientifically acceptable. What's called salami slicing, where you cut up research that could be published as one paper into many papers so that your publication rate goes up, things like that. Ritchie proposes some solutions. He says that openness and transparency are important within the scientific community and to the public at large. Improved and independent statistics, meaning that third-party unrelated statisticians look at results and see what conclusions they come to. Pre-registration and automated error checking he talks about as well, which essentially adds an additional stage of peer review into the scientific process. There's a great graphic here from the Center for Open Science that demonstrates this. So you would develop an idea, design your study, and then submit your research proposal for peer review so that other scientists in your field can criticize it and also know what your hypothesis is so you can't change it ahead of time. Know what your data collection processes are going to be so you can't change it after the fact. And then Ritchie also talks about a new culture of scientific humility and how it is important for scientists to admit when they have been mistaken and to try to remove themselves from the status of celebrity that frequently happens. I think that this book definitely does relate to what we've been learning in LIS 708, especially with regards to action research. Action research connects subjects and scientists in a really special way, which means that we must be vigilant in rooting out mistakes like benevolent bias, p-hacking, data obfuscation, because I think that there is a temptation, because we believe in the research that we are conducting in this context, and we want to see these conclusions result in direct benefit to our patrons. We need to make sure that that doesn't obstruct the integrity of the research. I think, too, that in learning how to conduct this action research, we need to be clear on the scientific norms that we need to inform the research we're conducting. Even if our conditions feel much different from a biology lab or an economics department, these norms and expectations and ideals still need to be preserved. If I were to conduct an action research study informed by this book, I think that first and foremost, I would pick one that's replicatory. That even though action research is frequently specific to a particular institution, I would love to try to replicate another study at my institution to see if I can uphold the results and to see if I can't, why not. I think that would be very valuable. I would also employ independent statistical analysis and get a third-party statistician. I would seek to publish our results openly and to the broader library community. And I would try to embrace not necessarily a disinterestedness, but a research process that is informed by objectivity as much as possible. In terms of personal impressions, I would recommend this book. I think particularly for folks who are statistically minded, it would be a great read. I am not necessarily one of those, but I still think that it was easy to connect with and compelling to read and surprising in some points. It definitely sharpened my critical eye in reading about too good to be true scientific studies and articles that friends and family post on Twitter and Facebook, to be able to look at that and say, I wonder how publication bias is impacting this. Or, I wonder if there was any manipulation of their probability factor, I think has been very helpful. And I think it also demystifies scientific publications and reminds us that anyone can make mistakes. Anyone can bring ulterior motives into their work, and that we need to trust but verify ourselves. So I think that was very helpful as well. And this is the citation of the book. Definitely encourage folks who are interested to take a look. Thank you very much.